Okay, thanks again, and we're going to jump straight into panel one. So to tackle this climate change and the energy transition in the context of global conflict and transnational risks or transnational security, we have three, I think, ideal speakers to tackle this. And so the first is, on my immediate right here, is Professor Marcus King. Marcus is a professor of practice in Environment and International Affairs at Georgetown University. His expertise includes environmental security, climate change, and conflict and transnational security, so exactly on topic. He brings experience from a number of government and non-government organisations, including CNA's Corporation Centre for Naval Analysis and the Sustainable Energy Institute. He's previously held presidential appointments in the Office of the Secretary of Energy and the Office of the Secretary of Defence, where he represented the United States in negotiating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. To Marcus's right is Morielle Lotan. Morielle is a published academic, entrepreneur and businesswoman. She's the CEO of Morielle Ventures, the co-founder of Climate180, and as a member of the international intelligence community, spends her time focused on this crossroads between energy and security. At Morielle, she works with CEOs and investors in disruptive startup industries focused on energy and security, and has served as an M&A advisor for Goldman Sachs. And in her role at Climate180, Morielle brings together a select group of clean energy companies, investors and government decision makers and industry representatives to sort of advance solutions for energy and climate challenges. And last but not least, to my far right is Professor Matthew Levinger. Matt is a research professor of international affairs at the George Washington University. There he directs the National Securities Program, an executive education program for senior officials from the US government and its international partners, and the Master of International Policy and Practice program at the Elliot School of International Affairs. And before joining GWU, he worked at the United States Institute of Peace, where he developed and taught programs on international conflict analysis and prevention. And then before that, he was the founding director of the Academy for Genocide Prevention at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. So clearly, we have a stellar group. But first, I thought I'd set the scene. And I think, as Amanda articulated, the impacts of climate change are on us. We've got unprecedented heat waves and forest fires from the west of North America to southern Europe to Australia. They're becoming increasingly frequent. Repeated major flooding in eastern Australia and South Asia, among others. And they provide examples of the kind of level of destruction and impact on human livelihoods that's really now starting to affect hundreds of millions of people on a pretty frequent basis. At the same time, we've had over 100 countries, well over 100 countries, have pledged to transition their economies to net zero emissions by around mid-century, more or less. And so in this phase, we've got to change all of this infrastructure, and meanwhile, critical infrastructure is highly vulnerable to these impacts of climate change. Whether they're civilian infrastructure, roads and bridges and things like that, power systems, or strategic military infrastructure, either of our own, our allies, or even our enemies, we're likely to see all of these things increasingly vulnerable. We face a number of locations in the world which are becoming increasingly unlivable, from South Asia to Africa. And so the impact on famine and migration is likely to become profound, and we're already seeing some of that. Melting ice packs are changing seaborne traded routes and opening up new sort of opportunities for resource exploitation and competition for that resource. And so all of these changes are going to have an impact on us and are having an impact on us, but they're also going to have a huge impact on military operations, strategic alliances, etc. And those strategic alliances and military alliances have kind of usually been mostly driven by ideology, but also by energy resources, as Maeder mentioned. But it raises two questions for me. How might the energy transition change our view about alliances? And when you come to confront something so global as climate change, is it time to have a rethink about the idea or the notion of allies and enemies? And so with that, I'd like to hand over to each of our panellists. We're going to have a few opening remarks for everyone, a few minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'd like to open the floor to you guys for the last at least third of the session. Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you. So given my background in the federal government of the United States, I wanted to talk about how climate security is shaping national security strategy, particularly from the DoD and component military perspective. So there's really three areas of climate change that affect military strategy, and that is climate mitigation, climate adaptation, but then this third area, which is failure to adapt to the consequences of climate change. So each area affects the national security strategy in different ways. Mitigation, first, Department of Defense and the complex is the largest energy user in the United States. The United States is the largest energy user in the world, so by the transitive property, they're a huge stakeholder. But also in the area of mitigation, Department of Defense uses its what I would call patient capital to help develop renewable energy projects, sort of bringing it across what's known as the Valley of Death, which you guys know very well, and providing some of that patient capital for RD&D. But in the area of adaptation, it's really the impacts on military infrastructure and the effects of, say, rising sea level, increased flooding, droughts, wildfires in the United States. In addition to being the largest energy user, the Department of Defense manages 1,700 military installations worldwide, many of which are affected by sea level rise. Hampton Roads is the largest concentration of military activity in the world, down on the Atlantic coast in Virginia. There's something called Black Flag Days now at Camp Pendleton out in California, the Marine Corps base. These are days when the forest fires in California are so severe that the smoke does not allow for training. And this has gotten to be, months out of the year, and this really affects readiness. But another area that climate change is affecting the military is in the roles and missions of the military. So now there's a greater, what we call demand signal for humanitarian operations and disaster recovery. U.S. Central Command's flown 400 metric tons worth of supplies for relief for the floods in Pakistan. But it's also helping allies as well as potential adversaries. So there was a Cyclone Nargis, 2007 in Myanmar. We lent help there as part of the demands in Indo-PACOM in that area. So it's not only humanitarian operation, but it's aid to allies and adversaries. But the sort of the most interesting area, and the area that I dwell on, at least within my scholarship and teaching, is this third area that I mentioned, which is the geopolitical implications of failure to adapt to climate change. But what are these impacts on what we call fragile states, or states that are important to the United States for national security reasons? So when it comes to environmental security and environmental conflict, we find that it is many times subnational, very persistent, and also very diffuse. So it's the sort of thing that the military, especially the United States military, has had the worst time historically trying to deal with. But migration tends to be a catalyst of instability, and this is having global repercussions. So I want to just quickly touch on a few areas where this is the case. Nowhere is this more evident really than the Sahel region in Africa, which is the band that stretches from the Horn of Africa in the east across to Burkina Faso in West Africa. They have more frequent and intense droughts brought on by climate change, which is pitting the sedentary farmers against the herders, the pastoralists in many of these countries. But what's really important is the underlying cleavages in society, be it rich and poor, sectarian, tribal cleavages. This is tending to open up what they call ungoverned spaces, which are areas that extremist groups have begun to fill, be it Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, now ISIS in West Africa and some of the other countries. So relations with the countries in Africa need to be rethought. Closer cooperation with some of these countries, including Nigeria. Nigeria has been a large contributor to peacekeeping forces. U.S. rethink maybe of the relationships with the African Union as one of the organizations that can deal with this. So there's sort of a separate but also conceptually related humanitarian emergency that's been unfolding in the Lake Chad area in the northwest of Nigeria. This involves 5 countries. And so also most recently in Somalia, there's been a famine situation building related to drought. So it's bilateral relationships with these countries that's going to be really important going forward and thinking about new ways to deal with some of these issues. And quickly, I want to touch on 2 other areas that have similar sort of symptoms. And one is this idea of shared river basins. And so in the Mekong Basin, the hydropolitics there, of course, are that China is the upper riparian in the river. But there's been unilateral development of dams by China in Laos, in Cambodia. Laos has said that they'd like to be the new battery of Asia. So it's really this idea of exporting energy to the other countries, and hydropower being a relatively clean source of energy. China has an increasing demand for energy if they're going to come anywhere near meeting their goals of their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Accord. So meanwhile, climate change is accelerating drought conditions in these lower riparian countries of the Mekong. Sea level rise has now created tidal surges, which are salinating the land in the Mekong Delta. River erosion is something I've been there and seen. That's having huge impacts. And so sooner or later, this is beginning to have real implications for food security, food insecurity. And so we're seeing things like rural to urban migration into cities, which are now strained in Vietnam. So obviously overt military reaction by these weaker states in the river system is not possible due to the asymmetrical power structure with China in the region. So this is creating new opportunities for multilateral and bilateral engagement for the United States. There's already some basis now of an alliance relationship with Vietnam over military issues, and now perhaps bilateral cooperation also around humanitarian assistance and clean energy provisions opportunity. There's been discussions with Thailand over a deployment of solar energy, for example. And so again, with river systems, there's similar dynamics unfolding in the Nile River Basin. We've got an area where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is being constructed by Ethiopia upstream of Egypt, which is also experiencing environmental degradation, desertification, flooding of the narrow fertile zone on each side of the Nile River. So I developed a scenario exercise with some folks at Harvard, the trade school up 95 there. And what we did is we went to the Emirates Diplomatic Academy in Abu Dhabi, brought 40 diplomats with us, where we played out a scenario for what could happen with climate change, sort of a credible scenario for 2040. And we found that these environmental factors came to a head of climate change impacts, where there was the potential for environmental migration of 10 million or so. And we also found that, just through the scenario playing out the moves, extremists seized a tanker and blocked the Suez Canal. So this is something we actually saw happen in terms of just an accident with the Evergreen incident, and then what those implications are for supply chains of this sort of interruption. But given regional dynamics, there was also no easy answer for environmental migrants. Obviously from Egypt, they weren't going to Israel. The absorptive capacity of Southern European states is limited in terms of accepting migrants due to sort of the illiberal regimes that are there and how they're thinking about migration. So new sorts of organizations were necessary. During the game, we found that the Gulf Cooperation Council wasn't the right fit. NATO doesn't exactly have the right mandate in that part of the world. The specialized agencies, the United Nations, like the International Organization for Migration, UN Development Program, none of them really had the mandate to bring groups together to try to deal with this sort of unfolding environmental emergency. So it's the idea of assessing the impacts and coming up with some new ideas. So what I just wanted to say is, in conclusion, the U.S. Intelligence Committee has looked at the ways in which climate change affects our military strategy, and it's, as I had said, through threats, through countries that are allies, but also adversaries, heightening social and political tensions that are underlying factors in some of these countries, adverse impacts perhaps on food security, but also the negative impacts on supply chains and economic competitiveness. So, others I think are bigger experts on energy, but what I think we'll see is the shift to clean energy technology plays a large role in determining what the severity is of these other 4 or 5 threats that the intelligence community has identified. So I'd like to pass it over to Morielle.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. Tech, climate, and security, I'm gonna try and jump ahead as quickly as I can, but let me just start out by saying I have built my career so far on asking what-if questions, and I thought that it started in academia, and then last week I spent a few days at my parents' home and went through my report cards and found a report card from kindergarten where the teacher wrote explicitly that my parents need to work with me better on asking too many questions and disrupting the class. So I guess it started much younger than I thought, and I hope I always continue to build my career around asking what-if questions. In addition to what's written on the brochure, I'm also a mother, and I'll mention a few of my milestones, including my motherhood, in answering your question. So this what-if muscle, and why is it important? You just mentioned that the intelligence community in the US are asking questions about how climate change will impact military operations and what happens when landing strips melt down and F-16s can't take off. And we are limited to asking ourselves questions that we think of. And the intelligence community, their main job is to try and think of those unknown unknowns, right? And I think that part of what we can do really well in academia, and probably earlier on as we're raising our children, is to foster this culture of what-ifs. Why are you seeing an image of a child's book on the screen? This is a book that I read my son 2 years ago and continued to read it to him. You can look it up later. It's called Randy Riley's Really Big Hit. And it's about a 6-year-old or 7-year-old boy who isn't really into sports, and everyone else is, and he discovers through looking through his telescope that there's a meteor coming. And everyone ignores him. And he goes and he tells his parents that there's a meteor coming, and in a few days we're all gonna be dead. And they say, you're being hysterical. And he goes and he builds this giant battery robot. It'll probably be a solar robot or a wind robot in the future, but it was a battery robot. And sure enough, the meteor comes and Randy Riley becomes the star of his town and everyone is saved. And I was reading it to my 5-year-old and I said, what if Randy Riley had listened to his parents thinking that he was nuts or, played sports and didn't go on and explore and didn't build this robot? And he looked at me and he said, everyone would be dead. And I said, and what's the lesson of the story? He said, don't listen to your parents and go and build robots. So how is this related to really a hat that I wear, which is primarily working with the startup community and with technology companies, 99% from Israel, by the way, which is where I grew up half of my life, entering the US market. And as part of my work, my company commissioned a social network analysis map of what the Israeli startup community was looking like and evolving into being around clean energy technologies. And the impetus for the work was really a dream of mine. As my team likes to say, every time I call them and I say I have an idea, they all duck and cover because they all think that it's going to mean a lot of work on their end, which it will. The idea was to try and look at how the startup community can really be almost a vehicle for diplomacy and collaboration that brings together multidisciplinary approaches with different technological solutions. And what really we aimed to create was to eventually see how a startup in Bangladesh or in Asia or in Israel or in the United States can partner with another startup around the world, of course fostered by academia as well. And the other reason was because there was a lot of inefficient deployment of capital that was being placed and is still being placed into early stage startups, early stage solutions. Of course, technology being a response most of the time to a lot of the problems that Marcus mentioned and I think that we all know exist. And I think that one of the really interesting ways to think about it is what if capital was deployed together instead of really creating or fostering the classical model of competition that we're used to seeing. That what if question has been rejected numerous times by members of the financial community here in the United States, but that does not deter me. I think that it only means that we should push further ahead. In 2010, as a student, as a master's student, I came to a professor of mine also from Harvard and asked him, what if the human factor, human operators of nuclear weapons needed to be taken into account in order to build deterrence policies. So human factor being a decision maker as opposed to just as a decision executor. And he said, go and explore it. And I started knocking on a few doors and asking this really major what if question back in 2010. And for about a year, I had that door slammed in my face. Extremely knowledgeable people from both the private sector and the public sector told me that nuclear weapons were no longer relevant, that the question was not interesting, that it wouldn't move or advance either academia or the private sector. I think everyone probably knows that a few years later, Russia invaded the Ukraine and took over Crimea, and there was a renaissance around nuclear weapons. Today, as we speak, there is a tremendous amount of conversation going on around current Russian forces in Ukraine and taking over nuclear power plants, and more interestingly, how members of his own inner circle now have extreme know-how and knowledge on what might happen and what kind of accidents could occur. That was probably the most significant what-if question I could have asked, and I encourage my students and the teams that I work with to try and press forward on that. Quickly, I want to give you an example, and I'm paying attention to the time. I see 29 seconds. I want to give you an example of a technology company that's asking strategic future questions, right? We have futurists as, I mean, if I could wish my children to be something when they grow up, I hope they're futurists. This company is a micro-weather prediction and forecasting startup, and its application has both private sector and public sector and security applications. For private sector, of course, it has to do with being able to forecast supply and demand, commodities, trading. The accuracy is extremely significant here. For the security and public sector, governments are now using these types of technologies in the security sector in order to plan for military training, plan for the ability to rescue. There was just an incident in the Himalayas, the ability to rescue teams that are stuck somewhere. It's not getting a lot of attention, and a lot of startups that have real solutions aren't, because there's a lot of noise and competition. And if we can try and think of collaborative models, like I mentioned in the beginning, and what if we can see a new model that brings together some of both capital and technology and academia and government, I think that we'll move along much quicker in solving for the issues that we all share, not equally, by the way. They are all global threats, but not equally shared. And I'll end on just asking us all to think about, what if we are missing the signals? What if we are reading the newspaper articles, and I know that you were asked a question earlier about media, and what if all of the textbooks that we're reading are trying to steer us in a direction and we're missing the criticality of thinking about the human factor in everything related to climate and energy and security, and if we're missing an opportunity as people to come together and really think about collaborative solutions that have applications for all of the sectors that I mentioned before. Thank you.
Thanks, Morielle.
How do I get to my presentation?
They'll do it for you.
Great. Oops. All right, so my topic today is geopolitics of climate change beyond the catastrophic convergence. And I'm going to speak on themes that dovetail with what both Marcus and Morielle have been addressing. In particular, I want to talk about the human factor. The journalist Christian Parenti has coined the term catastrophic convergence to depict the collision of political, economic, and environmental disasters that is emerging as the current and impending dislocations of climate change intersect with the already existing crises of poverty and violence. I'd like to illustrate the catastrophic convergence in 5 slides and then discuss some possible approaches to addressing it on the 6th slide. So here is a picture, or 2 pictures from Pakistan in August 2022. The BBC reported that 1/3 of Pakistan was completely submerged by historic flooding. Village after, according to Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, after flying over the area in a helicopter, village after village has been wiped out. Millions of houses have been destroyed. Now, note that this is due to monsoon-related flooding, not sea level rise. A 2019 study published in Nature Communications indicated that up to 630 million people live on land below projected annual flood levels for 2100, including 230 million who live below 1 meter of elevation. The largest number of these are in China, the Philippines, Egypt, and Indonesia. Here's China in August 2022. We see a picture of parched farmland in Sichuan province and the bed of the Jialing River, which was exposed in the city of Chongqing. According to weather historian Maximiliano Herrera, it was the most severe heat wave recorded anywhere. To quote Herrera, "This combines the most extreme intensity with the most extreme length with an incredibly huge area all at the same time. There is nothing in world climactic history which is even minimally comparable to what's happening in China." Together with the extreme heat, low rainfall in parts of China led to rivers falling to low levels, with 66 drying up completely. And there were follow-on effects. In the worst areas, factories had to shut down for lack of power because of both because the hydropower went away and because of increasing demand for air conditioning. This had ripple effects for the wider Chinese economy because the province is a key supplier of energy generated by hydropower to eastern industrial cities. This is perhaps the most important slide. The Tibetan Plateau, also known as the Water Tower of Asia, supplies fresh water to nearly 2 billion people. Experts fear that the region could see a near total freshwater storage collapse by 2050, which provides an interesting context to what Marcus was saying about dam building on the Mekong River, because this region serves as the headwaters for many of Asia's largest rivers, including the Yellow, Yangtze, Mekong, Salween, Brahmaputra, Ganges, and Indus rivers, among others. Note that Asia, which is the most populous continent, already has less fresh water available per capita than any other region. So what are we doing about this? Here is the state-of-the-art response. The United States builds walls to keep out climate refugees from Central America, while NATO ships patrol the Mediterranean to keep African climate refugees out of Fortress Europe. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin escalates his attacks on Ukraine, including on nuclear power plants. And in the Indo-Pacific, the US and China intensify their great power competition over the status of Taiwan and over various atolls in the South China Sea that will soon be underwater. Now, how do we explain this disconnect between the problem and the solution? Christian Parenti writes that damaged societies, like damaged individuals, often respond to new crises in ways that are irrational, short-sighted, and self-destructive. He warns that, quote, in much of the world, it seems that the only solidarity forthcoming in the case of climate change is an exclusionary tribalism. This is not natural and inevitable, but rather the result of a history, particularly the global North's use and abuse of the global South, that has destroyed the institutions and social practices that would allow a different, more productive response. So what is to be done? I offer these two books as not solutions to all of our climate challenges, although there are a lot of interesting ideas in both books. They are both utopian books, in a sense. Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, and Earth for All, which is a book I think published just this month as a report to the Club of Rome. But both of them seek to expand our imaginations about the possibilities for creative responses to the climate emergency. They both ask the question, what if in the midst of this global catastrophe there are opportunities to make life better for all of Earth's inhabitants? Now, I'd just like to very briefly highlight what the Earth for All report emphasizes. They talk about 5 extraordinary turnarounds, including food system turnaround, the energy turnaround, but also eradicating extreme poverty, reducing economic inequality, and achieving gender equality, which the authors see as indispensable steps toward maintaining social cohesion in the era of unprecedented environmental stresses. Now, I'd just like to emphasize, I think that the technological solutions won't work unless we're able to deal with these profound social fissures and social challenges, because policy changes won't be sustainable unless they're seen as equitable and unless a range of stakeholders have a stake in the solution. So I'm just going to end with two general observations from the field of conflict management, which is my specialty, which I think can serve as a starting point for further discussion. 2 principles to keep in mind. 1, find initial areas of international collaboration on which we can build incrementally, which is particularly important in an era of very intensive geopolitical polarization. We might look at issues, for example, like managing transnational watersheds in a more collaborative way and stabilizing the global food system as starting points for collaboration. 2, we need to transform incentive structures for the relevant actors to reward constructive actions and penalize destructive actions, and that I think really builds on Morielle's point about new investment models. Okay, I'll stop here and turn the floor over for a discussion.
So I'd like everyone to try and think of questions, because I would like most of the questions to come from you. But I think to kick it off, my question for all of you, I think, is, obviously these emerging geopolitical risks associated with the impacts of climate change are really serious. And obviously, we talked about the Mekong watershed, we talked about the US role. Do you think it's possible to see a rethink on the US's sort of military and sort of strategic positioning and approach to China as a way of getting started on this? And how might that play out? And I don't mind who would like to go first, but I think it's a question you would all be able to go with. If you don't volunteer, I'll volunteer you. Go ahead.
I mean, I can start. I think that what we're seeing as our keynote speaker addressed, the U.S. has developed this consensus around getting tough on China since Trump's entry into office. And the Biden administration has tried to nuance this by saying, we're going to compete, but we'll also cooperate where necessary. And frankly, I don't think you get to cooperation by leading only with competition. I think you need to, I think you really need to cultivate areas for collaboration while taking, very much into account this need, we do need rare earth minerals from diverse environments. Apple shouldn't be making all its iPhones in China, and so forth and so on. But I think the conversation needs to be modulated in a way that starts with the collaborative challenge that we all face, and then says, while we're collaborating, there are certain areas where we're going to have to compete. And I don't see that changes happening. I see our rhetoric as escalating the conflict rather than as de-escalating it at this point.
Anyone got a solution?
I can just speak from experience. The startup community today, when they're raising capital, again, in an extremely difficult environment for early stage startups, there is a lower level antagonism and separation from Chinese capital and a divestment from, really a turn away from China as an investor, not only as an investor directly, but if anyone has any type of company that's determined on supply chain coming out of China, then they're usually turned away. I agree with you very much that I think that that's more of the same type of rhetoric. And just as far as the military is concerned, I'll just remind us that oftentimes the ground up, so bottom up approaches, like you will see in the private sector and the startup community, will allow for the type of cooperation that you don't necessarily think of or see higher up. And I'm assuming we'll see more of that pressure coming from the bottom.
I just wanted to add something about the Belt and Road Initiative. So the way that China has been sort of developing, projects and infrastructure in Africa and other places, has not really been sustainable, environmentally sensitive. So I think in terms of challenges and opportunities within the U.S.-China relationship, I think there's like some new areas where there is competition that climate change brings along. And one of those can be ways that we can bring technology and other investments into development that's a lot more climate sensitive, it's a lot more environmentally sensitive. So that's sort of a new fora. Another one that might be interesting is China started to step in to be more active in humanitarian assistance related to disasters. They've built a new hospital ship, things like that. So the United States, I think, can project into the Indo-PACOM, the Pacific region, and build these bilateral relationships with countries around disaster relief to do with climate change. And one quick one I'll just add is the U.S. Coast Guard has a new capability they call the National Security Cutter. And what they're doing with these cutters is they're taking global tours. And one thing they've been working on with the Vietnamese, for example, is sustainable fisheries, learning boarding and interdiction against environmental crime. So this is another area of cooperation that, has to do with environmental degradation, but in ways that, China's not sensitive to.
And Matt, I'll jump back to you. I mean, one approach is through things like your master's program on national security and transnational risks, which is to senior officials in the Department of Defence, from intelligence through to all of the different other defence organisations. Are you seeing kind of the sort of geopolitical conflicts and the sort of the disconnect between that and energy, climate and other grand challenges? Is that sort of theme starting to become a major focus for you, or for the students?
It's certainly a focus for me, and that's why I invite you every time to come talk about the challenge of climate change and energy transition. And we also have speakers on resilience coming into the course. It's a hard sell, you know, and because this issue has become so heavily politicized within the U.S. And I think certainly people, you know, 3-4 years ago, people would say, well, if you give me 3 experts who tell you climate change is human caused, I can find you 3 who say it's not. Certainly you could, you know, but they would be wrong. And now I think it's starting to penetrate. But I think that there's you know, just the slides that I showed suggest that there's this complete mismatch between the instruments at hand and the objectives. And that's the direction I think we need to move. I think there's a lot of concern that, you know, we have a very fear-based approach to our national security, and climate change is another thing to be afraid of. And we need to find areas for collaboration and identifying shared goals in order to create a space for effective collaboration. So I think that need to create shared goals is critically important. You need to have some sort of sense that the task is feasible in order to be able to tackle it effectively. And that's what we're trying to do in my program.
Mm-hmm. Morielle, you're sort of dealing with the private sector and the intelligence community, and your focus is more so in Israel, Europe, and the like. Are you seeing any kind of alternative approaches through that community in terms of treating climate change and the energy transition as a much more global issue?
Look, I think that my criticism of the intelligence community is that they have not seen their role as leaders to think of solutions, but more that their role is to examine what reality is. And that's a gap that I think is going to start shifting. I think that the strategic future exercises that, the joint, by the way, strategic future exercises between the US and Europe and Israel are lending themselves much more now to rely on the private sector, on technology companies, and on academia to inform those questions. I think that we're at a really opportunistic moment in time in that sense, that we're seeing the role of government changing, we're seeing the role of academia hopefully changing as well, to be more at the forefront of leading these types of questions and solutions. And I'm personally very hopeful that we're going to see more of that happen as we move forward.
And Marcus, you made the point about climate refugees, and you know, you only have to look at international news programs now and you're seeing problems in Somalia, we've seen problems in Syria. How do you think we need to approach this, and particularly from the perspective of the US?
Right, so the term climate refugees is a little bit of a misnomer in the sense that when you are a refugee, you know, the juridical status in international law is that you are then granted the right of asylum by a country. And so, you know, due to persecution, so usually it's political persecution or it's human insecurity. And so we don't have an international construct yet that would recognize the environment as a forcer that would cause someone to be a refugee. Yet we're looking at this you know, situation by maybe 2050 where there'll be millions of refugees. And one of the areas in terms of the United States would be what they call the dry corridor in Central America. So Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras. So these are countries where people are coming, you know, agricultural lands being deforested, food security is an issue. They're moving to the cities. The cities are very insecure with gangs, things like that. And so it's not so much Mexican immigration, it's those people from Central America coming through Mexico. So what's the prescription? One idea that I have is related to climate finance. So under the UN Framework Convention, it's an idea of mobilizing this money that's out there put by national governments and multilateral development agencies like the World Bank to do climate adaptation projects within the countries, in the poorer countries. So this is something they've talked about in COP26 in Glasgow, mobilizing more money for harm and damages in these countries, and something that'll probably come up in COP27. And so the question is, how do you sort of solve the people's problems where they are so they wouldn't need to migrate? And part of that is more mobilization of funding, especially by the US in these countries. And so quickly, there's something called the Global Fragility Act, which was passed about a year ago by the Congress, and this has identified 5 countries where development assistance, especially around energy and adaptation, is mobilized through a conflict avoidance framework. And so it's the idea of, could we also think more under the Fragility Act of directing that investment toward countries that are that have climate sensitivity and vulnerabilities? Because right now there's these 5 countries identified, and it's not driven by thinking about climate. There's other strategic interests at play.
And as I understand it, when it comes to the Climate Fund, most of that capital is promised, but very little of it has been mobilised. And so what's going wrong there?
Well, I think one thing is, and maybe other people could talk about it, is that this money for the Climate Fund comes from national governments, right? And executive agents for it can be the World Bank and other multilateral development countries. And so what I'd like to see is more actors involved in that. So there's a place for the private sector, multinational corporations, to also find methodologies to contribute to that climate finance pot, because as you know, federal governments have fallen so far short to their commitments. And so bringing in industry multinationals into conversations, within the comp to the parties process, like COP27 coming up in November, it's very important to get stakeholders from, it's really a whole of society issue, not just a foreign development assistance issue.
So look, at this stage, I'd like to open the questions to the floor. So we have quite a few. We have microphones roaming, and then when you are called, can you give your name and affiliation, please?
Thank you. I'm David Shatsky with Deloitte. You're really bumming us out here.
What is it, bum us out?
I'm curious about. It seems like some of the engines of progress and the frameworks for collaboration that have served the international system really well over decades are being called into question. Globalization seems sometimes to be moving in reverse. With the trust in institutions at both the national level and the international level has plunged, and these are mechanisms that we might have once pointed to as ways of tackling global problems. And so I'm wondering if what you think will take their place, or how they will be repaired or rejuvenated in order to tackle the problem of the scale and the global kind of natures that we're facing.
Yeah, I can, if that's okay. It's a great point. I think that when you look, first of all, I agree that there is a framework to lean upon, right? We're not inventing the wheel with thinking about collaborative models. When you look at multinational players, when you look at Equinor out of Norway, one of the largest wind players in the United States today, when they entered the US, they did it by partnering with local companies. They either bought them, they merged with them. The idea of collaboration isn't new. When you look at earlier stage technology companies, especially in an environment where there's such competition and somewhat of a politicization of climate, you don't see as many collaborations. The competition for funding is much, much more fierce. And so in this industry, in the climate clean tech sector industry, which is looking to solve these global challenges, I think that what I'm trying to allude to is that if we form at the earlier stage those type of collaborations that we can, again, lean upon from looking at the larger players, then we'll see solutions scale much quicker, and we'll also see them go to market at a more of a global reach than they are traditionally done right now in the startup community.
Maybe I'll just speak to that very briefly also. I think that the big governments are not working very well, generally in many parts of the world. But I think there are lots of opportunities for collaborative partnerships at a wide range of levels, and businesses can really play an extraordinarily important role. I think government policy has to use capital much more efficiently in setting the incentives in ways that will enable companies like Linus to come to market, for example. Because I think there's a lot of the government intervention has not been very efficient, and it's but that's something that other people are more expert than I am.
And to some degree, I mean, Amanda's story about the government approach of 1,000 flowers blooming, and your approach of, we need to get critical mass together. I think this is important.
Yeah, the story about Japan, Hitachi, right? Was it Hitachi?
No, it's the government. It's actually Japan.
Yeah, so both from the private sector and the government is a classic story of partnership working.
And then I think we have a question here.
Thank you so much. Barbara Buckings, I'm Associate Research Scholar at the Policy School here. So I heard a lot more about the impact of climate change on geopolitics, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about the other direction. So opportunities for individuals and countries and populations that are most affected to leverage geopolitical concerns into obtaining climate action, or at least climate commitments. So I'm thinking in particular about the Pacific Summit that happened a couple of weeks ago, where the Biden administration got together with Pacific Island states, really in an effort to do something about China's inroads in that region, in particular what was happening in Solomon Islands. Now, the press around it was interesting because the Biden administration had very little interest in talking about climate. This was not part of the various sort of the pronouncements, the press releases, etc. But some of the islands were very interested in this and mentioned sea level rise, mentioned the sort of commitments they were looking for in terms of technology transfer. And I know some of these diplomats, and sort of that's also why I'm following it. I'm hoping to chat with them a little bit at COP in a month. But I'm interested to hear what you think opportunities might be for them to leverage this moment into climate action. So from geopolitics to climate change action. Thank you.
It's a great point of leverage for Solomon Islands and other imperiled islands to apply that leverage. But I think, in some ways, Marcus might have good comments to offer on that subject as well.
Yeah, so at Georgetown, we recently hosted some of the leaders from the small island states who were both working through the recent Pacific Forum, but also, the sort of part about that is the countries that are dependent on the U.S. were renegotiating the free association agreements. And so it was much higher on the agenda of these countries to be sensitive to climate adaptation, through sea level rise, for example. I lost track of how much that issue emerged in the actual discussion, but obviously that's something that is very important to these countries and we need to respect. And then also, sort of what I was talking about as a way of hedging against Chinese influence is really showing our sensitivity to those climate adaptation issues in those countries and those foreign territories and trust-dependent islands.
And it's not just the US, right? I mean, Australia is on their doorstep. We ignored them forever. China comes along and says, we're taking over security and we're going to build a port, and suddenly it's a massive threat. So we just really have to rethink that.
And also, I think the private sector and the renewable sector specifically is leveraging geopolitics right now extremely well. I think that the move towards energy independence, democratizing energy, that entire conversation many people are saying thank you very much to Putin for invading, and are doing what they need to do business-wise in order to excel their companies. So,
I think we have another question. Here, Rob.
Rob Sokolow, Professor Emeritus Princeton. We need new texts. We need new objectives that we can build planetary arrangements around. And I have two. The first is we really are not demanding of ourselves that we learn more deeply and faster about the Earth itself, climate science. We have not got a commitment from the US, for example, to expand the climate science effort so that we learn faster about the deep ocean, about forests, about permafrost. And it could be it is already a global science. It's one of the best examples of global science. But it's not being emphasized. It's not being identified as a place to build relationships the way it could be. And I don't know how you get from here to there on this one, but it's been obvious, and it's been startling, let me say, to me, that as we expand the priority of the climate problem, we aren't also demanding of ourselves that we expand the level of effort in getting straight what it actually is. We have this commitment to believe we know enough to act, so let's not say that we need to know more. And that's really in the way. The other is on various solutions. We've said very little about what the world is going to be experiencing as it decarbonizes. The expansion of wind and solar all over the place is going to create issues that are going to be common across areas. How do we produce solar and wind that is somehow less intrusive? There'll be ideas that move along, but a carbon dioxide pipeline network is going to be built all over the world. It's going to be done in the similar problems that we haven't really put at the front of our minds are going to rise all over the place. If we're going to have nuclear power, we need a much stronger international atomic energy agency, much, much stronger to have a safety, because they'll be mutually dependent power plants. And then in the wings is the geoengineering objective, which maybe one of the panelists can comment on. It's on the verge of being turned into rival national programs to dominate any changes we make on the planetary scale. And that would be really scary. And I think we have to keep the geoengineering objective as some kind of planetary consensus objective, or we'll be off the rails in that direction. So I'd like to hear comments on this handful of ideas here.
I couldn't agree more with you about the importance of stronger planetary science. On the geoengineering issue, I agree with you, Rob, that ultimately it's necessary to slow the pace of change, and whether or not it's necessary, it's going to happen as countries perceive it to be necessary for their own interests. And this is an area where I think there's been reluctance on advocates of rapid energy transition to go that direction, because they say, well, if we do geoengineering, people aren't going to be willing to focus on energy transition. I think that's wrong. I think that what we need to do is establish certain models for collaborative international cooperation. And with any kind of geoengineering approach, there will be environmental risks, which need to be mitigated. They need to be assessed and regulated. There will also be winners and losers, and the losers need to be compensated. And since this is a global thing, you need a global mechanism. I think if there were global collaboration around developing some protocols for exploring and implementing geoengineering approaches, that would be one area where you could start to generate more international collaboration. I think collaborative water management needs to be reinvigorated. Historically, one of the big surprises of water disputes is that they haven't led to war, because you've had treaties between Israel and Jordan, you have a treaty over the Indus waters between India and Pakistan, but these need to be renegotiated and strengthened. And food security, it's a global problem. How do you stabilize the global food system without without undermining local agriculture, but rather making agriculture more feasible in drier climates, but also stabilizing prices when there are food shocks. There are a whole range of global governance challenges that can be dealt with in a focused and targeted way that would develop a pattern of better international cooperation. And so I think we need to look for these little wins where we can start to create institutions that will enable us to take on the larger problem.
I can't speak to geoengineering, but I will say something about what kind of a world are we going to live in and what are the types of questions that we're asking ourselves. At the end of the day, I think that leadership is where it really matters. And I don't just mean leadership in government. I mean leadership at home and leadership in private companies and across the board. And if we surround ourselves with yes men and women and more of the same, and we stay uncomfortable to have diverse teams which was spoken about this morning, and we are unable to hold on to that tension of conflicting views, then I don't see how we will be able to answer that question wisely. And so I think that it's on us as adults and leaders, again, across the board, to really make an effort, even though it's uncomfortable, to have people around us to have these types of conversations with who hypothesize and suggest solutions that are many times, we might even be allergic to.
And not surround ourselves with people who agree with us.
Yes,
And,
correct.
And to say, the obvious in this community is to nurture leadership and innovation. That really needs to come from the academy, among other places. And so the idea of mobilizing the philanthropic investment and other ways to bring more science education into the picture, but also science education in an interdisciplinary way that brings also knowledge of public policy and international affairs, and creates people that can think more imaginatively about bringing the science more into the conversations and more into the development of policies. And this goes especially for the US, but also globally.
And we've got time for one more question. I don't know if it's up here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kortler. I'm a Princeton PhD student. And I know a couple years ago, the Abraham Accords were this impressive achievement of Middle East relations warming, which people thought was maybe born of this common enemy situation with Iran. Now, a big facet of the Abraham Accords actually was talking about scientific collaboration. And I was wondering if, given Israel's impressive climate technologies, if you see a further warming of relations in the Middle East with Israel, either on a more diplomatic scale or an under-the-radar startup tech sort of scale.
Great. Does anyone want to take it?
That's good.
Look, Israel has the first fusion civilian nuclear company has just been announced in Israel. It's a major event, obviously, for, I think, the globe, and also speaks directly to your question. That would not have been possible if it wasn't for, or at least the scaling of it wouldn't have been possible without the Abraham Accords. There is a tremendous amount of partnership occurring right now between Israel and the MENA region. We will only see that happening more and more. I think that there is a history of knowledge that Israel possesses around areas of our mutual concern, water, for example, as you mentioned before, that it will be continuing to share with its neighbors, and other areas, food security, drought, salination. So that was a long-winded way of saying, yes, I think it's going to happen much more, and I'm very much excited about it.
Well, I think that brings us to a close. I'd like to thank our three panelists, Marcus, Morielle, and Matt. We couldn't have had a better group to do this, but before we do thank them, quick comment about what comes next. We're going to lunch. It's at the Frick Chemistry Building, which is probably a 10-minute walk. We're going to have a couple of hours for lunch, so plenty of time to network, and there'll be posters from the students. Then at 2, we'll be back here, Maeder Hall, for our afternoon keynote, which will be a fireside chat with Jesse Jenkins and Jigga Shah. And the theme is going to be America's approach to commercialisation. And make sure you take your belongings from here, and look forward to seeing you back. And so to close, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank Amanda for a fantastic keynote, and I'd like to thank our panellists for a fantastic panel discussion.